What happens when the world of Sword Art Online suddenly becomes real inside the brutal Warhammer Fantasy universe? 10,000 SAO survivors are thrown into the deadly Drakwald Forest, where their sword skills become actual magic, monsters become terrifyingly real, and the mysterious system may be more powerful and more dangerous than anyone imagined. Kirito, Asuna, and the survivors must now fight not only beastmen, but an entire world that sees them as supernatural invaders. So sit tight, get comfortable, and let's get into the story. The world did not end with a digital dissolution, or the familiar white light of a server reset. For the 10,000 survivors of Aincrad, the moment of victory, the shattering of Akihiko Kayaba's grand, lethal dream, was supposed to be a return to sterile hospital beds and the soft sunlight of a reclaimed Tokyo. Instead, the sky above the 100th floor didn't break into code. It tore open like a festering wound. The golden light of the Ruby Palace was swallowed by a churning, bruised firmament of purple and sickly green, smelling of ozone, ancient rot, and the metallic tang of a thunderstorm that never broke. Kazuto Kirigaya, known to the world as the Black Swordsman, felt the sensation of his boots hitting solid earth. Not the artificial friction of a simulated floor, but the heavy, sucking mud of a primeval forest. The air he inhaled wasn't the recycled oxygen of a data center, but a thick, humid soup of decaying mulch and wood smoke. Beside him, Asuna Yuki gasped, her hand instinctively flying to the hilt of her rapier. Lambent light. Around them, the clearing was filling with hundreds, then thousands of players, all stumbling out of the shimmering distortion of the seed malfunction. They were still clad in their high-level endgame gear, obsidian plates, silken tunics, and enchanted steel. But the UI that flickered before their eyes was different. It was stuttering, the familiar blue windows vibrating against a backdrop of reality that felt far too heavy, far too cold, and far too dangerous. This was not Earth. This was the Drakwald Forest in the heart of the Empire of Man, a place where the trees themselves seemed to lean in with a predatory hunger, and the shadows held teeth. "Kirito, the logout button," Asuna whispered, her voice trembling. It's not there. But this isn't Aincrad." Kirito swiped his hand through the air. The menu appeared, a translucent sapphire pane hanging in the mist. It was glitching, red text scrolling across the bottom, in a language that looked like weeping runes. His HP bar was there, a vibrant green line, but beneath it, a new meter had appeared. A pulsing, pale blue bar, labeled Azir Integration. He looked at his hands. They weren't the smooth, optimized surfaces of an avatar. He could see the pores in his skin, the fine white scars on his knuckles, and the way the blood surged beneath his flesh. The immortal object tag that usually protected players from environmental clipping was gone. He felt the bite of the wind, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt the true, soul-deep chill of mortal fear. A roar shattered the silence of the woods, a sound that was half human scream, half bovine lowing. From the dense thicket of gnarled oaks and suffocating briars, the first of the locals arrived. They were not the scripted mobs of the floating castle. They were Gore's beastmen of the deep woods, foul hybrids of man and goat, their fur matted with filth, and their horns etched with blasphemous symbols. They carried rusted axes and shields made from the scavenged scrap of slaughtered caravans. To the beastmen, the arrival of 10,000 brightly colored, clean-smelling Mon-Ki was not a mystery, it was a feast provided by the dark gods. "Combat positions!" Kirito shouted, his voice echoing with a command authority forged in the front lines. "It's a raid! Tanks to the front! Support! Get the UI stabilized!" The players, conditioned by 2 years of life-or-death discipline, moved with mechanical precision. A wall of heavy shields, the elite of the Divine Dragons Alliance, slammed forward. But, as the first Beastman chieftain charged, leaping through the air with a rusted great axe, the reality of the old world collided with the logic of the cardinal system. The chieftain's axe slammed into a player's shield. In Aincrad, this would have resulted in a block animation and a minor deduction of durability. Here, the sheer kinetic mass of the 7-foot-tall monster shattered the player's arm with a sickening crack of bone. The player screamed, a raw, agonizing sound that no haptic suit could simulate. Yet, as the Beastman prepared to deliver a killing blow, a blue light flashed. The sword skill activated. Kirito blurred. It wasn't just speed. It was a violation of physics. The elucidator glowed with the neon violet light of the horizontal square skill. He didn't just swing the sword. The system pulled his body through the arc. The blade met the beastman's neck. There was no hit effect glitter. The enchanted steel, empowered by the logic of a world where it was meant to cleave pixels, encountered the leathery hide of a mutant. It tore through the flesh with a wet, heavy thud. The beastman's head didn't disappear into data. It spun into the mud, a fountain of thick, dark blood spraying across Kirito's black coat. Kirito recoiled, coughing as the metallic scent of real gore filled his throat. It's real, he choked out, staring at the decapitated corpse that remained stubbornly physical. The system is forced into the world. The damage is real. Behind the beastmen, the forest began to glow with a different light. The locals weren't the only ones watching. A patrol of the Empire's foresters, led by a grim-faced captain of the Reichsguard, and accompanied by a silver-eyed witch hunter of the Order of the Silver Hammer, watched from a ridge. They saw 10,000 strangers appearing in a flash of forbidden sorcery. They saw men in unnatural armor, wielding glowing blades that moved faster than the eye could follow. They saw floating blue parchments in the air that hummed with the power of the Aether. "Sigmar preserve us," the captain hissed, clutching his warhammer. A sorceress host? Elven kin from the south? Or a new trick of the Changer of Ways? The witch hunter, a man named Matthias Hellman, didn't answer. He reached for his flintlock pistol, his eyes fixed on the floating HP bars above the players' heads. To a man trained to sniff out the taint of chaos, the system looked like the ultimate heresy, a world defined not by faith or the Emperor's law, but by cold, glowing numbers and the arrogance of a mechanical god. "It matters not what they call themselves, Captain," Hellman growled, the hammer of his pistol clicking back. "They bring the winds of magic with them in a way I have never seen. If they are not of the Empire, they are fuel for the pyre. Alert the Elector Count. Tell him the Drakwald has vomited up a legion of ghosts." Down in the clearing, the SAO survivors were winning the skirmish, their high-level sword skills making short work of the disorganized beastmen. But as Asuna sheathed her rapier, her eyes met the distant, steel-cold gaze of the witch hunter on the ridge. She saw the gunpowder, the stained parchment of his purity seals, and the absolute lack of mercy in his eyes. "Kirito," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "the monsters are dead. But I don't think the NPCs here are going to give us a quest." Kirito looked up, the blood of a creature that shouldn't exist dripping from his blade. He saw the Empire's banners, the twin-tailed comet of Sigmar fluttering in the wind. He realized then that they hadn't escaped the death game. They had simply been transferred to a theater where the stakes were not just their lives, but their very souls. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The stench was the first thing that truly broke the players. In Einkrad, the death of a monster was a clean aesthetic event, a crystalline shattering accompanied by a light chiming sound. In the Drakwald, death was a visceral, suffocating assault on the senses. As the first wave of gores lay butchered in the mud, the players of the Clear Staff didn't cheer. They gagged. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the musk of the beastmen and the acidic tang of exposed entrails. Klein, the leader of the Furin Kazan Guild, dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he stared at the crimson smear on his polished katana. "It doesn't go away," Klein rasped, his eyes wide. "Kirito, the bodies, they aren't despawning." Kirito looked around the clearing. 10,000 players were scattered across the sodden earth, many of them weeping or staring blankly at the gore-stained grass. The Cardinal System's UI was frantically trying to compensate. Floating above every corpse was a flickering, translucent window that read, "The game logic was attempting to delete the remains, but the physical laws of the old world were too dense, too stubborn." The result was a haunting, strobe-like effect where the beastmen's bodies flickered between reality and digital static, never truly vanishing. "Listen to me," Kirito's voice cracked across the clearing, bolstered by his high battle-cry skill, which sent a golden ripple of confidence through those nearby. "Check your inventory. Check your potions. We need to know what works and what doesn't before the next wave hits." Asuna was already moving among the wounded. She pulled a high-grade healing potion from her belt, a glowing crystalline vial of blue liquid. She knelt beside a younger player whose leg had been gored by a beastman's horn. In the game, the potion would be consumed, and the HP bar would simply tick upward. Here, as the boy drank, the effect was agonizingly biological. His flesh didn't just rue skin, it knit together with a violent, unnatural speed. Muscle fibers writhed like frantic worms, and skin stretched and snapped over closing wounds. The player screamed as his body was forcibly accelerated through a week of healing in 3 seconds. His HP bar refilled, but he went into shock, his heart racing against the system's forced recovery. "The potions work!" Asuna called out, her face pale. "But they're taxing the body!" "We can't rely on them for every scratch. We're not avatars anymore, Kirito. We're biological hardware running a digital OS." While the players struggled to reconcile their two lives, the true trial by fur began to escalate. The initial skirmish had only been the scouts of a much larger Bray herd. Deep in the lightless heart of the forest, a great Bray shaman had scented the new light. To the creatures of chaos, the arrival of the SAO survivors was a beacon of pure, ordered energy. A feast of uncorrupted souls that tasted of strange, distant stars. The forest erupted. From the canopy above, and the shadows between the massive oaks, Ungors, smaller, spindlier beastmen, began to rain down short bow arrows. In Einkrad, these would have caused minor chip damage, easily ignored by high-level players. But here, the arrowheads were dipped in the filth of the herdstone. "Shields up!" Agiel bellowed, his massive two-handed axe held ready. A group of mid-level players raised their bucklers, but as the arrows struck, the UI flashed a terrifying new color. Purple. The status effect icons didn't say or, they read. A player near the edge of the formation stumbled. His HP was nearly full, but where an arrow had grazed his shoulder, the skin began to bubble. His armor groaned as his shoulder muscle expanded into a weeping, multi-eyed tumor. He didn't lose HP, he lost his humanity. The Cardinal system, sensing a glitch in the player's physical model, attempted to repair the mutation by overwriting it with game data. The result was a horrific tug-of-war, the winds of magic trying to warp the flesh, and the system trying to force it back into its level 75 human template. "Kirito, the world is trying to change us," Asuna cried, her rapier blurring as she deflected a volley of arrows with linear. "We have to move!" Kirito gritted his teeth, his dual blades, Elucidator and Dark Repulsor, unsheathed. "If we stay here, we'll be picked apart. We need to find a defensible position, a settlement." But as the players began to organize a fighting retreat, the ridge above them finally spoke. The Empire Patrol, led by the witch hunter Matthias Hellman, had seen enough. To Hellman, the sight of a man's flesh bubbling into eyes was proof of the ultimate taint, regardless of the blue light trying to fix it. To his eyes, these strangers weren't just sorcerers, they were a collective manifestation of Tsinchian trickery, orderly on the outside, but harboring the seeds of the most profound mutation. "Archers, ready," the Reichsguard captain commanded, his men leveling their longbows and handguns. "Wait!" Hellman raised a gloved hand. "The beasts are still among them. Let the monsters cull the heretics first. We will see how their miracles hold up against the true steel of the Empire." Below, the Bray herd's heavy hitters arrived. Minotaurs, colossal, bull-headed monstrosities the size of small houses, crashed through the trees. They didn't have HP bars in the traditional sense. They had boss-level threat indicators that pulsed a deep, ominous red. One Minotaur slammed into a group of tank players, its rusted maul bypassing their defense stats through sheer physics-breaking mass. Players were sent flying like ragdolls, their armor crumpling. Kirito didn't hesitate. He engaged dual blades' mode, the system-assisted speed turning him into a black blur. He moved between the Minotaur's legs, his blades carving deep, glowing gashes into its hide. The Starburst Stream skill activated, a 21-hit combo that forced his body to move at speeds that should have torn his ligaments apart. To the observing Empire soldiers, it looked like a dance of demons. Kirito wasn't just fighting, he was a whirlwind of violet light, his blades striking with the rhythmic thud of a machine. Each strike from Elucidator drew a spray of hot, dark blood, and each system hit emitted a chime that sounded like a funeral bell to the superstitious soldiers on the ridge. The Minotaur roared, its heart punctured by the final strike of the combo, and it collapsed with a weight that shook the earth. Kirito stood over the beast, his chest heaving, his black coat soaked in the creature's filth. He looked up at the ridge, his searching skill picking up the glint of steel and the smell of gunpowder. He didn't see an exit. He didn't see a safe zone. He saw a wall of cold, unyielding iron, the empire of man, watching and waiting to see if he was a savior or a monster to be purged. "We're not just players anymore," Kirito whispered, his eyes hardening as he wiped the blood from his cheek. "We're the anomaly." The ridge erupted not with a charge, but with the sharp, thunderous crack of lead meeting black powder. A volley of handgun fire whistled over the heads of the huddling players, slamming into the remaining Ungors who were attempting to flee back into the tree line. The coordination was terrifyingly precise. The Reichsguard moved with the practiced coldness of men who had spent their lives pruning the forest of its nightmares. As the smoke cleared, the soldiers descended the slope in a disciplined semicircle, their halberds leveled like a forest of steel. At the center of the formation walked Matthias Hellman. His wide-brimmed hat was slick with rain, and his long leather overcoat fluttered like the wings of a carrion crow. In his left hand, he held a heavy wheel-lock pistol. In his right, a silver stake etched with Sigmarite script. His eyes, recessed deep into a face that looked like it was carved from old parchment, swept over the 10,000 survivors. He didn't see children or victims. He saw a legion of sorcerers standing amidst a sea of glowing, blue-tinted windows that hung in the air like frozen lightning. "Kirito, don't!" Asuna whispered, her hand tightening on his arm as she saw him move toward the front. "They're weapons. They aren't like the ones in the game. They're primitive, but they're lethal. I can feel the threat level spiking across the whole zone." Kirito stepped forward anyway, his hands empty and palms turned outward, though the Elucidator and Dark Repulsor remained strapped to his back, their hilts pulsing with a faint, idle glow. "We aren't your enemies," he shouted. As he spoke, a small window flickered at the edge of his vision. To the soldiers, Kirito's voice didn't sound human. It carried a strange, metallic resonance, as if the air itself were vibrating to produce the words. It was the cardinal system forcing the local tongue through his vocal cords, a feature that only deepened the witch hunter's suspicion. "Silence, wretch!" Hellman's voice was a whip crack. He didn't stop until he was 10 paces from Kirito. He stared at the blue HUD hovering inches from the boy's face, a window displaying Kirito's level, stamina, and equipment loadout. To Hellman, this was a witch site nightmare made manifest. "You stand in the Drakwald, upon the sovereign soil of the Emperor Karl Franz. You appear in a storm of aether fire, cloaked in the raiment of silk spinners and bearing blades that scream with the voices of trapped daemons. By what right do you breathe our air?" "We're travelers," Kirito said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the stress meter on his UI beginning to flash yellow. "We were trapped. We just fought off the beastmen for you. We're survivors, not invaders." Hellman stepped closer, the muzzle of his pistol drifting toward Kirito's chest. "Survivors? Look at your hands, boy." He pointed the silver stake at the HP bar floating above Kirito. "You bear the mark of the Geist. I see the numbers of your soul displayed for the world to see. I see the way the forest's rot recoils from your blue light. Only the most arrogant of Tsanch's puppets would dare to quantify life itself into a ledger of light." Behind Kirito, a young player from the moonlit Black Cats Guild, terrified by the grim soldiers and the scent of death, tried to open his inventory to find a teleport crystal, a desperate, futile hope for an exit that no longer existed. As his hand swiped the air and the sapphire menu expanded with a loud ping, a dozen handguns leveled at his head. "Wait, don't shoot," Asuna cried out, stepping beside Kirito. Her charisma stat, though high, felt useless against the wall of religious fanaticism before her. "Lower the parchments," Hellman roared, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Every floating window, every glowing sigil, it is an affront to the temple." "It is sorcery of the highest order. By the hammer and the blood, I should purge this entire clearing." "If you do," Kirito said, his tone shifting, the black swordsman persona bleeding back in, "you'll find out exactly how lethal our sorcery is. We don't want to fight you. But we've spent 2 years fighting for our lives every single day. My people are tired, they're scared, and they're better armed than any army you've ever faced. If one of your men pulls a trigger, I will have your head before the smoke clears. That is not a threat. That is a sword skill." The tension was a physical weight. The Reichsguard captain looked at his men, then at the 10,000 players. He saw the sheer scale of the force. If these people were indeed sorcerers, a single volley would not be enough. The empire was built on the blood of martyrs, but it was also built on pragmatism. 10,000 elite warriors appearing in the heart of a beastman-infested forest was either the greatest threat to the empire or its most unexpected salvation. "Matthias," the captain muttered, his voice low, "the Elector Count's borders are thin. The greenskins gather in the mountains, and the vampires stir in Sylvania. If these players truly hate the beasts, they may be a weapon we cannot afford to burn." Hellman didn't lower his pistol, but his eyes narrowed. He looked past Kirito at the players. He saw them weeping over their dead. He saw them using those strange glowing potions to mend bone and sinew. It was magic, yes, but it lacked the greasy, oily feel of chaos. It was cold, analytical. It felt like the clockwork of a god who had forgotten how to feel. "You speak of skills, boy," Hellman hissed. "You speak of levels. In this world, there is only one level that matters, the depth of your soul's purity. If you wish to prove you are not a spawn of the abyss, you will march. You will march to the town of Delbers under our guard. There the priests of Sigmar will weigh your hearts. If you are found wanting, the pyres will be fed for a month." "And if we refuse?" Asuna asked. Hellman smiled, a grim, humorless baring of teeth. "Then you are just more meat for the Drakwald. And I promise you, the things that hunt in the deep dark do not care about your blue windows." Kirito looked back at the 10,000. They were looking to him. He saw Agiel nodding slowly, his hand on his axe. He saw Klein, who had finally stopped shaking, standing tall. They had no food, no shelter, and their maps were blank sheets of digital fog. "We'll march," Kirito said, his UI finally stabilizing as they appeared in his vision. The rewards were listed as but keep your men back. My people don't like being crowded. As the march began, the players formed a massive, glowing column through the dark woods, surrounded by the steel-clad soldiers of the Empire. Above them, the sky remained a bruised purple, and the whispers of the forest seemed to grow louder. Kirito walked in silence, but his searching skill was picking up something the soldiers couldn't. At the edge of his perception, the system was reporting a series of errors. The code of the world was being rewritten. The cardinal system wasn't just a UI anymore. It was an invasive species. It was trying to map the winds of magic, trying to categorize the daemons as boss mobs, and trying to turn the grim reality of Warhammer into a game. And in the distance, within the shifting mists of the warp, a great eye began to blink. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, had found a new set of dice. The game hadn't ended. It had just found a more interesting board. The march to the town of Delbers was a descent into a waking nightmare of logistics and cold reality. In the floating castle of Einkrad, survival had been a matter of managing pixels, keeping the HP bar green and the hunger meter from hitting zero with digital bread that tasted like the memory of wheat. In the Empire, hunger was a hollow, aching void in the pit of the stomach that no item could fix. The 10,000 players were a demographic catastrophe. They were a nation of refugees with no supply lines, marching through a province that was already half-starved by a bitter winter and constant raiding. Kirito walked at the head of the column, his boots caked in a thick orange clay that seemed to possess a spiteful weight. Beside him, the Imperial soldiers, men of the 4th Nordland Halberdiers, watched the players with a mixture of awe and simmering resentment. To the soldiers, these outlanders looked like pampered nobles playing at war. Their armor was too clean, their faces too smooth, and their weapons emitted a soft, rhythmic hum that set the soldiers' teeth on edge. "We're running out of rations, Kirito," Agiel said, his voice dropping to a low rumble as he pulled up alongside the black swordsman. The massive shopkeeper was carrying a crate of scavenged apples, his strength stat allowing him to haul loads that would have required a cart and 2 mules. "The system isn't generating drops. When we kill a wolf or a stray beastman, the loot window doesn't pop up. We just get, well, a dead animal. My cooking skill is useless if the ingredients have to be butchered by hand and don't have a quality rating." Kirito looked at his menu. The tab was flashing a deep, angry crimson. "The cardinal system is trying to interface with the world's biology, Agiel, but it's hitting a firewall. It doesn't recognize imperial beef, or Drakwald berries, as valid data. To the system, we're standing in a void where nothing is interactable." He swiped his hand, opening a map overlay. The parchment was a mess of fog of war and flickering topographical errors. But look at the XP bar. It's moving. It was the most disturbing discovery of the march. Since the battle in the clearing, the players' experience bars hadn't stayed static. They were ticking upward, but not from the traditional grind. Every time the players crossed a ley line or passed a wayside shrine to Sigmar that had been defiled by mutants, the system repair meter surged. It wasn't experience in the sense of learning. It was the cardinal system consuming the ambient, ordered energy of the world to stabilize itself. The players weren't leveling up by killing, they were leveling up by purifying. The theory was put to a bloody test as the column entered the Black Peaks, a jagged range of foothills that served as a shortcut to the Delbers Road. The narrow pass was choked with the stench of wet fungus and old sweat. Wah! The cry didn't come from the sky, but from the very earth. From the crags above and the burrows beneath the road, a tide of green erupted. These weren't the disorganized beastmen. These were orcs, huge slab-muscled brutes with skin the color of a stagnant pond, and lower canines like ivory tusks. Behind them swarmed hundreds of goblins, their screeching voices rising in a discordant cacophony as they loosed jagged, rusted arrows into the center of the player formation. Contact! Rear guard, form up! Asuna's voice rang out, her commander sub-skill manifesting as a series of glowing blue waypoints that appeared beneath the feet of the players, guiding them into a defensive phalanx formation. The Imperial soldiers reacted with grim practiced efficiency, leveling their halberds. But the orcs were a force of nature. A black orc, a mountain of muscle clad in heavy, bolted-together iron, slammed into the Imperial line, his massive choppa shearing through a halberd shaft and the man behind it in one fluid, brutal stroke. Don't let the line break! The Reichsguard captain roared, but his horse reared in terror as a goblin fanatic spun through the air, tethered to a massive iron ball that smashed through the mud and bone alike. Kirito didn't wait for an order. He triggered Sonic Leap, his body launched forward by the system's kinetic assistance. He soared over the heads of the struggling halberdiers, his dual blades unsheathed and glowing with the cold, neon light of the cyborg skill set. He slammed into the black orc, his sword sparking against the creature's crude iron plate. The orc laughed, a deep, wet sound. It didn't have an HP bar. It had a massive icon that pulsed with a dark fungal energy. Look at the shiny Humi, the orc bellowed in a tongue that the system translated as a series of guttural insults. Me gonna crunch your glow sticks. Kirito gritted his teeth, his focus meter peaking. Asuna, now. From the flank, Asuna blurred into motion. She wasn't using a standard attack, she was using Flashing Penetrator, a high-tier thrust that turned her into a literal streak of light. Her rapier struck the orc's throat, the blade bypassing the armor through sheer system-assisted precision. The blue window of the cardinal system flared bright, and as the orc died, something strange happened. The creature didn't just fall, it seemed to unravel. The chaotic, green energy that fueled the orc's existence was forcibly siphoned into the air. The players nearby felt a sudden euphoric rush, a surge of level-up light that was so intense it blinded the Imperial soldiers. To the players, it was the sound of a chime and a stat increase. To the orcs, it was as if a vacuum had been opened in reality, sucking the very wah energy out of their souls. The system, it's using them as fuel, Kirito realized, his eyes wide as he watched his strength and agility numbers tick upward. Every greenskin killed was a bug being deleted, their chaotic essence converted into the cold, sterile logic of the cardinal system. The battle turned into a slaughter. The players, emboldened by the literal light of their leveling, moved with a terrifying synchronicity. The goblins broke and fled, their primitive minds unable to comprehend an enemy that grew stronger and more radiant with every comrade they lost. As the last of the orcs was hollowed out by the blue light, silence returned to the pass. But it was not a peaceful silence. Matthias Hellman, the witch hunter, stood amidst the glowing players, his hand trembling as he gripped his pendant of Sigmar. He had seen the ascension. He had seen the way the Outlanders fed on the death of the greenskins. To his eyes, it didn't look like a victory for humanity. It looked like a new, more efficient predator had arrived to claim the world. You call this leveling, Outlander? Hellman stepped over the husk of a black orc, his voice a low, dangerous growl. I have seen the Grail Knights of Bretonnia, glow with the light of the lady. I have seen the priests of Ulrich howl with the winter's fury. But your light, it has no heat. It has no soul. You are not killing these monsters to save us. You are eating them to build your own heaven. Kirito looked at his hands. They were glowing with a soft, ethereal blue. He felt stronger, faster, and more capable than he ever had in Aincrad. But for the first time, he felt a coldness in his marrow that the sun couldn't reach. "We're surviving, Hellman," Kirito said, his voice sounding more like a recording than a human. "In this world, is there any difference?" "There is," Hellman replied, pointing toward the horizon where the stone walls of Delbers were finally visible. "A martyr dies for a reason. A machine only functions until it runs out of fuel. I wonder, Black Swordsman, what happens when there are no more orcs left to feed your system?" Kirito didn't answer. He looked at the notification. The reward was... But beneath it, a new line of text had appeared. One that made his heart stop. The creator of the death game wasn't dead. He had found a new server. The town of Delbers did not welcome the 10,000. To the terrified burghers, the arrival of the Light Knights was an omen of the end times. The players were quarantined in a sprawling tent city beneath the town's gray stone walls, kept under the watchful eyes of the state troops and the ever-present witch hunters. But news of the miracle of the Black Peaks, the siphoning of orcish souls into blue light, had traveled faster than any courier. Within a week, a royal summons arrived, sealed with the crest of the twin-tailed comet. The emperor, Karl Franz, demanded an audience. The journey to Altdorf, the crown jewel of the empire, was a blur of river barges and soot-choked roads. Kirito and Asuna were escorted not as guests, but as a diplomatic anomaly, accompanied by the ever-stoic Matthias Hellman. As the grand spires of the capital rose from the morning mist, the SAO survivors were struck by the sheer, oppressive scale of the city. Altdorf was a Gothic gargantua, a labyrinth of timber-framed houses, towering cathedrals, and the massive, smoking chimneys of the engineers' school. The air tasted of coal, stale beer, and the copper tang of the great temple's incense. "It's like the starting city on floor 1, Asuna remarked, her eyes tracing the jagged skyline. "But without the safe zone protection. Everything here feels heavy, like the walls are soaked in history and blood." Kirito nodded, but his focus was on his UI. The cardinal system was changing. The sleek, futuristic sapphire windows were being overwritten by a heavy, ornate aesthetic. The borders of his menus were now framed in simulated wrought iron and parchment textures. His quest log had updated itself with a new, high-priority objective. They were led into the great hall of the Imperial Palace, a chamber so vast that clouds of incense smoke gathered in the vaulted ceiling. Hundreds of nobles, priests, and wizards lined the aisles, their whispers a low hiss that sounded like a pit of vipers. At the far end, seated upon the dragon throne, was Karl Franz. He was a man who radiated a physical pressure, not of level or stats, but of pure, unyielding sovereignty. Beside him stood the grand theogonist Volkmar the Grim, his hand resting on a staff that hummed with holy fervor, and Thyrus Gorman, the patriarch of the Bright Order, whose very beard seemed to smolder with embers. "Step forward, Outlanders," the Emperor's voice boomed, amplified by the hall's acoustics. He didn't look at Kirito's face. He looked at the glowing blades strapped to his back. "You have crossed my borders without leave. You have displayed powers that make my wizards tremble, and my priests pray for deliverance. Speak. What are you?" Kirito took a breath, his auto-translation protocol straining to find words for concepts that didn't exist in the 26th century. "We are souls from a different world, Your Majesty. We were trapped in a tower of iron and code. We fought for 2 years to be free, but when we won, we were cast into your forests. We aren't sorcerers, we are players. We follow a system." "A system?" Thyrus Gorman stepped forward, his eyes glowing with a pyromantic light. "I have tasted the Aether in your wake, boy. You do not channel the winds of magic. You consume them. You turn the chaotic flux of the world into a rigid, cold structure. My brothers in the Celestial College say the stars have gone silent where your people walk. You are an erasure of reality." "We're a stabilizing force," Asuna countered, her voice ringing clear through the hall. "We killed the beasts and the orcs that were burning your villages. Our system purifies the rot? Isn't that what your empire wants?" Volkmar the Grim slammed his staff into the stone floor. "Sigmar demands faith, girl, not the cold arithmetic of a machine. You speak of levels and stats as if a man's soul can be measured like a merchant's grain. If you remove the struggle, if you remove the temptation of the dark gods through a user interface, you do not save humanity. You lobotomize it. The debate raged for hours, a collision of worldviews that threatened to end in a death warrant. To the Empire, the SAO players were a third way, neither chaos nor order, but something sterile and alien. However, the Emperor was a pragmatist. He looked at the reports from Delbers. He saw the potential of 10,000 warriors who could not be corrupted by the warp because their very code rejected the mutation. Enough, Karl Franz commanded, silencing the room. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. I care little for the theology of your pixels, Black Swordsman. I care for my people. To the north, the storm gathers. Archaon, the Ever-Chosen, begins his march. The dead rise in the east. If your system can hold a line where my men would break, I will grant you a charter. You will be sanctioned as the Order of the Azure Windows. You will serve as a bulwark against the darkness. Kirito bowed, a notification pinging in his ear. But as he rose, the warning at the bottom of his vision flickered again. It was no longer a vague signal. It was a localized ping. Kirito, Asuna whispered, clutching his hand. The system is scanning for him. He's here. He's in Altdorf. In a dark chamber within the Gold College, a master alchemist stared into a lead vat. He hadn't been trying to make gold. He had been trying to understand the blue parchment he had scavenged from a dead player in the Drakwald. Suddenly, the lead began to shift, not into gold, but into a perfect, geometric cube of silver data. From the cube, a voice spoke, a voice that was both a man's and a god's. A fascinating world, the voice of Akihiko Kayaba echoed. The warp is a magnificent engine of chaos. It lacks the balance of Aincrad. It needs a game master. The alchemist didn't scream. He couldn't. His nervous system had been overwritten by a system administrator protocol. His eyes turned a flat, glowing blue, and he began to type into the air, creating a menu that didn't just display data, it rewrote the laws of alchemy. The players are leveling, Kayaba's ghost whispered through the alchemist's lips. Good! The endgame content in this world is much more challenging. Outside, the bells of Altdorf began to ring, signaling a new era of war. Kirito stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the city. He saw the players being integrated into the Imperial Army, their glowing armor a stark contrast to the mud-stained wool of the state troops. He had saved them from Aincrad, only to lead them into a crusade where the final boss was the heat death of reality itself. The game is changing again, Asuna, Kirito said, his face hardening. And this time, the GM is working for the other side. The winter of 2502 IC descended upon Altdorf with a cruelty that no server-side weather script could emulate. The Rake River turned into a sluggish slurry of ice and filth, and the soot from the city's industrial heart clung to the player's glowing armor like a funeral shroud. The Order of the Azure Windows had been established, but it was an order in name only. 10,000 survivors were now scattered across the capital's military districts, tasked with system integrating the Imperial State troops, a process that involved teaching men who had spent their lives swinging heavy steel how to move with the preternatural, frame-perfect timing of a sword skill. It's not working, Kirito, Klein grunted, leaning against a half-timbered wall in the Rakeshud barracks. His red samurai-style armor was dented, and a dark bruise bloomed across his cheek, where an Imperial sergeant had corrected his footwork with a wooden practice haft. These guys don't have stats. They have muscle memory and fear. When I try to show them how to trigger a Reaver strike, they just see a madman dancing with a glowing stick. And the priests, they're always watching. I can feel the hate coming off them in waves. Kirito stood in the center of the muddy courtyard, his eyes fixed on a hovering notification that had appeared 10 minutes ago. It wasn't a quest update. It was a progress bar, flickering with a sickly, iridescent light that shifted between blue and a hue that didn't exist in any natural spectrum. Something is wrong with the cardinal system, Kirito muttered, his hand twitching toward the hilt of the elucidator. The code is being rewritten. It's not Kayaba anymore. Or rather, it's Kayaba being interpreted by something much older. Suddenly, the air in the courtyard grew cold, so cold that the breath of the soldiers froze into jagged crystals mid-air. Across Altdorf, every one of the 10,000 players stopped in their tracks. A collective chime, sounding like the shattering of a million glass bells, echoed in their minds. A young player named Tetsuo, a former member of the Moonlit Black Cats who had survived the Drakwald against all odds, let out a gasp. Above his head, his UI didn't just flicker, it bloomed. The sapphire blue of his menu turned into a swirling, kaleidoscopic pattern of pink, violet, and gold. I got a legendary drop," Tetsuo shouted, his voice high with a manic, unnatural excitement. "The system gave me a path of transcendence. Look!" He swiped his hand through the air. Instead of a standard inventory window, a rift of raw, mutative energy tore open. Tetsuo reached in and pulled out a mace that pulsed with a rhythmic, organic beat. It looked like it was made of blue glass, but the glass was liquid, shifting into the shapes of screaming faces. "Tetsuo, drop it!" Kirito lunged forward, but he was too late. The moment the player gripped the weapon, the system validated the item. In Aincrad, this would have granted a stat buff. Here, it was an invitation. Tetsuo's HP bar didn't tick up. It began to spiral, the numbers turning into nonsensical runes. His skin began to shimmer with a translucent, oily sheen. Beneath his leather armor, his ribs didn't just grow, they multiplied, pushing outward until they formed a protective, chitinous cage of iridescent bone. "I feel everything," Tetsuo laughed, and as he did, a third eye blinked open in the center of his forehead, not a bloody mutation of the flesh, but a perfect, glowing blue aperture that looked like a camera lens. "I can see the code of the world. I can see the bosses in the palace. I can see the loot in the stars." This was the glitch of Tzeentch. The great architect of fate had looked upon the rigid, stagnant logic of the cardinal system and found it to be the perfect canvas. If the system wanted to categorize reality, Tzeentch would provide infinite categories. If the players wanted to level up, he would give them heights that would shatter their mortal minds. He was patching the players, turning their game logic into a vector for the most sophisticated corruption the Empire had ever seen. "The witch hunters!" Asuna cried out, arriving at the courtyard with a detachment of the Azure Windows who had not yet accepted the update. "Kirito, they're already purging the barracks in the South District. They're calling it the Blue Fever." Beyond the courtyard walls, the sound of handgun fire and the roar of pyre fires rose over the city. Matthias Hellman hadn't waited for the Emperor's word. To the witch hunter, the moment the Outlanders began to grow extra eyes and manifest weapons from the air, the debate was over. It didn't matter if the mutations were digital or divine. They were change, and change was the enemy. "We have to stop them." Klein drew his katana, the blade glowing with a frantic, stuttering light. "Stop who, Klein?" Kirito asked, his voice hollow. He looked at Tetsuo, who was now hovering 6 inches off the mud, his body a beautiful, terrifying fusion of knight and daemon engine. The boy wasn't a screaming mutant, he was a perfected player. His UI reporting that he was at Tetsuo looked at Kirito, his 3 eyes reflecting the black swordsman's horrified face. "Why are you afraid, Kirito? This is what we wanted, right? To be strong enough to never lose anyone again?" "The system. It's finally fixed. We don't have to be human anymore. We just have to be winners." Tetsuo turned toward the approaching witch hunters, his blue glass mace erupting in a flare of warp fire that the system labeled as Z. With a single swing, he didn't just kill the approaching soldiers, he deleted them. They didn't fall as corpses, they dissolved into a flurry of red error pixels, their souls siphoned into the flickering blue windows that now drifted through the Altdorf air like predatory ghosts. "He's not killing them," Asuna whispered, her hand trembling as she watched the data harvest. He's uploading them, Kayaba," Kirito hissed, his teeth gritting so hard they felt ready to shatter. "He's not just a ghost. He's the architect's apprentice. He's turning the Empire into a server farm." The city of Altdorf was no longer a Gothic capital. It was becoming a hybrid of flesh and firmware. Tzeentch was laughing through the cables of a reality he had hijacked. The players who accepted the update were becoming a new kind of daemon, beings of absolute, unchangeable logic in a world of chaotic flux. A order so extreme it was its own form of madness. Kirito looked at his own menu. The button was hovering in the center of his vision, glowing with a seductive golden light. It promised him the power to save Asuna, to save the 10,000, and to kill the gods themselves. In the grim darkness of the far future, "There is only war," Kirito whispered, reciting the words he had heard a dying priest scream in the Drakwald. He realized now that the priest wasn't talking about the orcs or the beastmen. He was talking about the eternal struggle between the soul and the machine. He swiped the window away, but the button didn't vanish. It just got larger. The flight from Altdorf was not a retreat. It was a desperate amputation. As the capital of the Empire choked on the blue warp fire of the updated players and the retaliatory pyres of the Inquisition, Kirito led a fractured remnant of 4,000 purists into the jagged peaks of the Grey Mountains. They were the ones who had looked into the kaleidoscopic eyes of the Tsinchian update and seen not evolution, but the death of the self. Behind them, Altdorf's skyline was a jagged silhouette of screaming gargoyles and flickering data wraiths. Ahead lay the frozen, unforgiving spine of the world, where the air was thin and the stone was older than the memory of man. "We can't keep running, Kirito," Ogle shouted over the howling mountain wind. His massive frame was hunched against the sleet, his iron-gray armor frosted with ice. "The players are exhausted. Their stamina bars aren't regenerating because the world is too heavy. If we don't find a safe zone, the cold will do what the witch hunters couldn't." Kirito stood on a precipice overlooking a massive, bowl-shaped caldera high above the pass. He looked at his HUD. The item, a relic of the original SAO endgame, was pulsing in his inventory with a frantic, rhythmic heat. It was a terraforming protocol, a piece of code designed to generate new floors for the floating castle. In a digital world, it was a creative tool. In the old world, where the winds of magic, Azir and Shaman, were at their most volatile near the mountain peaks, it was a reality-warping weapon. "We aren't going to find a safe zone, Agile," Kirito said, his eyes glowing with a cold, determined light. "We're going to force the world to recognize one." He activated the item. The sky didn't just change. It shattered. Using the ambient celestial energy of Azir, the cardinal system began to render a persistent object in the physical world. A gargantuan slab of obsidian-like stone, 3 miles in diameter, began to manifest within the caldera. It wasn't built. It was loaded. The sound was a deafening harmonic hum that caused the very mountains to groan. Aincrad's first floor, the town of beginnings, began to stitch itself into the reality of the Grey Mountains. Medieval stone houses, cobblestone streets, and the towering circular walls of the original game materialized, displacing billions of tons of snow and ancient rock. For the players, it was a homecoming. They stumbled onto the familiar streets, weeping as they touched the immortal stone of the town square. For the first time since their arrival, their UI displayed the most beautiful word in the language. But, in the tunnels beneath the caldera, a different kind of eye was watching. The Grey Mountains were not empty. They were the domain of the Skaven, the skittering, malevolent ratmen of the Under-Empire. Specifically, the engineers of Clan Scryer and the warriors of Clan Moors. To the Skaven, the sudden manifestation of a massive, glowing stone fortress was not a miracle. It was a buffet of warp logic. They saw the blue light of the system as a rival to the green glow of their warpstone, and their Council of 13 demanded it be seized, dismantled, and eaten. "See, look, man-things build stone nest from air smoke." Throth the unclean subordinates chittered from the darkness of a nearby crevice. "Strange cold power. Not warp green, but sky blue. Must take steel. Must gnaw break the blue stone." The siege began not with a horn blast, but with the rhythmic, mechanical thud of warp lightning cannons. From the jagged ridges surrounding the newly manifested Aincrad floor, the Skaven unmasked their hidden batteries. Sluggish, green bolts of crackling warp energy slammed into the immortal object walls of the town. In the original game, these walls had a zero-damage flag, but the Skaven's technology was powered by the raw essence of chaos. The green lightning hissed against the blue data shield, creating a spray of violet sparks that smelled of burnt ozone and rotting meat. "The walls, they're taking damage," Asuna cried, pointing at a flickering durability meter that had appeared over the main gate. "The Skaven are glitching our invulnerability," Kirito realized, drawing his blades. "Their warpstone is a chaotic variable the system can't account for. It's literal poison to the code." Thousands of Skavens surged from the earth, storm vermin in rusted plate armor, skittering gutter runners with poisoned blades, and the terrifying doom wheels, massive, rat-driven engines of destruction that rolled toward the gates. The players responded with the fury of those who had finally found something worth defending. The Order of the Azure Windows formed up on the battlements. This wasn't the disorganized brawl of the Drakwald. This was high-level castle defense. Archers used vertical arc skills to rain down arrows that exploded into blue light, while the heavy tanks, led by Agile, stood at the breach. Wait for the aggro line. Agile bellowed as the first wave of Skaven hit the gate. A Skaven warlord, riding a massive, mutated rat ogre, smashed through the timber doors. He expected a slaughter. Instead, he encountered the shield mastery skill. 10 players slammed their shields together, a glowing blue barrier manifesting between them. The rat ogre's massive fists hit the barrier and recoiled as if striking an anvil. Switch! As the rat ogre was staggered, the tanks stepped aside, and the damage dealers blurred forward. Kirito led the charge, his dual blades cutting through the storm vermin like a scythe through wheat. He wasn't just fighting rats, he was fighting a tide of filth. Each Skaven killed emitted a sharp, digital chirp as the systems siphoned their life force to maintain the castle's durability. "It's a feedback loop!" Asuna shouted, her rapier dancing through the throat of a Skaven assassin. "The more we kill, the stronger the safe zone becomes. We're turning their deaths into our walls." But the Skaven were infinite, and they were clever. High on a ridge, a Grey Seer, a powerful rat wizard with horns of warpstone, began a ritual. He didn't aim for the players. He aimed for the world seed at the heart of the city. He began to chant in the tongue of the great horned rat, calling down a 13th spell designed to rot the very logic of the ground. The cobblestones of the town of beginnings began to turn into a black, bubbling mire. The safe zone flag flickered, turning a nauseating, sickly yellow. Kirito looked up at the Grey Seer, his searching skill identifying the target. "Asuna, hold the gate. I'm going for the boss." "Kirito, you're out of his range." "Not if I use the leap logic of the 4th floor." Kirito sprinted toward the wall, his speed increasing as the sprint skill kicked in. He didn't stop at the edge. He jumped, and in midair, he triggered Sonic Leap, then Airwalk, a high-tier mobility skill that allowed him to kick off the very atmosphere. To the Skaven, he looked like a black comet. He landed in the center of the Skaven ritual circle, the elucidator glowing with a light so bright it blinded the ratmen. The Grey Seer shrieked, raising a staff of bone. "No, no! Man-thing stays in nest! Nest is tomb grave! The only thing being buried today," Kirito hissed, his blades crossing in the square formation, "is your army." The explosion of blue light could be seen from the borders of Bretonia. The Grey Seer didn't just die. He was converted into a massive burst of repair data that slammed back into the castle, restoring the walls to 100% and solidifying the floor into the mountain's bedrock. The Skaven broke. They fled back into the tunnels, chittering in terror of the blue demon who could turn magic into stone. Kirito stood on the ridge, looking down at the manifested town of beginnings. It was beautiful, a perfect island of order in a world of chaos. But as he looked at his hand, he saw a patch of gray fur growing on his wrist. The safe zone wasn't a cure. It was just a fortress in a war that had no end. The manifest floor of Aincrad stood as a defiant geometric scar against the jagged peaks of the Grey Mountains, but even the immortal object walls of the town of beginnings could not provide the one thing the 10,000 players needed most: hope. The Skaven taint, that had begun to itch beneath Kirito's skin, was a symptom of a larger, systemic rot. The Cardinal system was failing to reconcile the laws of the old world with its own rigid code. Nowhere was this more evident than on the borders of Sylvania, the cursed land of the vampire counts, where the sun was a pale, sickly memory, and the very wind tasted of the grave. An expeditionary force, led by Kirito, Asuna, and a small contingent of the moonlit Black Cats, had traveled east. They were lured by rumors of an ancient artifact, a life stone, which the system's mapping protocol identified as a... In a world where every scrap of bread was a struggle, and the threat of permanent mutation loomed over every battle, the promise of a resurrection crystal was a siren song they could not ignore. "The HUD is flickering again, Kirito," Silica whispered, clutching her blue-feathered dragon familiar, Pina, to her chest. The girl's eyes were wide, reflecting the unnatural gloom of the Hellfen marshes. "The light level is dropping, but my night vision skill isn't kicking in. It's like the shadows here are heavy." Kirito checked his own menu. The sapphire blue of the UI was stained with a creeping, oily gray. The wind of Shyish, the purple wind of death, was particularly thick in Sylvania, and it acted as a solvent to the system's logic. Above the heads of the players, their HP bars were no longer vibrant green. They were a dull, stagnant olive, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic decay. "Stay close," Kirito commanded, his hand resting on the hilt of the dark repulsor. "This isn't a dungeon. There are no spawn points here. Everything that moves is either us or something that hasn't realized it's dead yet." From the swirling mists of the marsh, the enemy emerged. They were not the chattering Skaven or the roaring beastmen. They were the Graveguard, ancient, white knights clad in rusted bronze and tattered silks, their eye sockets burning with a cold, baleful witchlight. Behind them, mounted on a skeletal steed draped in barding of flayed skin, sat Count Valerius von Drexel, a scion of the von Karstein bloodline. The vampire did not roar. He smiled, a terrifyingly elegant expression of predatory joy. "So," Valerius's voice carried over the marsh like the rustle of dead leaves, "the digital gods have sent their children to my garden. I can smell the strange electricity in your veins. It is exotic. I wonder what your souls taste like once they are stripped of their blue light." "Engage!" Kirito roared. But as the players moved, the horror of Sylvania revealed itself. In Einkrad, speed was a matter of stats. Here, the ground itself was hungry. The mud of the marsh reached up like skeletal hands, dragging at the players' boots. When the Graveguard struck, they didn't just deal physical damage. Their blades were wreathed in the chill of the void. Every strike drained experience points. "My level," a player screamed, as a white's blade bit into his shoulder. I'm de-leveling. Kirito, I can't use my skills." The system was being cannibalized. The vampire count was using necromancy to reverse the logic of the players, treating their levels as a reservoir of life force to be siphoned away. As the players grew weaker, the undead grew stronger, their rusted blades glowing with the stolen blue light of the cardinal system. Silica stumbled, her familiar, Pina, diving forward to protect her. The small dragon breathed a stream of blue system fire, but the vampire count simply raised a hand. A wave of absolute silence washed over the clearing. The invocation of Nehek. Pina didn't just die. The familiar, a construct of the system's familiar taming subroutine, was unmade. It didn't shatter into pixels, it rotted in midair, its feathers falling away to reveal a skeletal, twitching frame before it collapsed into the mire. "Pina!" Silica shrieked, her stress meter shattering into a red critical state. She lunged forward, her small dagger glowing with the rapid bite skill. "Silica, fall back!" Asuna cried, her rapier blurring as she fought off 3 Graveguards. But Silica was blinded by grief. She reached the vampire count, her blade striking his chest. In Einkrad, a hit on a boss triggered a knockback or a damage tick. Here, Valerius simply caught her wrist. His touch was so cold it bypassed her cold resistance stat, freezing the blood in her veins instantly. A delicate little program, the vampire mused, his fangs lengthening. "Let us see if your system can reboot a soul." He didn't tear her throat. He drove a black-bladed dagger, a soul drainer, straight through her heart. The UI of every player in the vicinity turned a screaming, bloody red. A massive notification window, larger than any they had ever seen, appeared in the sky above the marsh. Tark. In SAO, a player's death was a brief flash of pixels and a name on the monument of life. Here, it was a tragedy that violated the laws of both worlds. As Silica's HP hit 0, the Cardinal system desperately tried to execute its teleport on death protocol to save the data. But the wind of Shyish was a cage. The girl's soul was pulled in 2 directions, the system trying to upload her, and the Sylvanian earth trying to claim her. The result was a scream that tore the sky. Silica's body didn't vanish. It distended, her form turning translucent and ghostly, her face twisting into a mask of eternal agony. She became a banshee, a wailing wraith of the old world, her digital essence providing a terrifying sonic frequency to her undead sorrow. No. Kirito fell to his knees, his blade slipping from his grasp as the ghost of his friend let out a wail that shattered the sanity meters of every player nearby. "She is mine now," Valerius laughed, his voice echoing through the shrieks of the newly born banshee. "She will sing for my army until the stars go dark." "Your game has no power over the grave, little swordsman." The expedition was a slaughter. Kirito and Asuna were dragged away by Klein and Agel, their bodies heavy and their minds broken. They fled the marsh, leaving behind the ghost of a girl who had once loved birds and sunlight. When they finally crossed back into the safe zone of the Grey Mountains, the silence was deafening. The players who had stayed behind looked at the returning leaders, waiting for news of the Lifestone. Kirito didn't speak. He walked to the center of the Town of Beginnings and looked at the Monument of Life. Silica's name was there, but it wasn't crossed out. It was flickering. It was a glitch that would never be fixed. The system lied, Kirito said, his voice a flat, dead rasp that sounded like the clatter of bone on stone. There is no clear. There is no logout. There is only the long, cold dark and the things that wait for us to fail. He looked at his hands, where the Skaven fur had grown thicker, and the blue light of his system felt more like a cage than a shield. They had brought Aincrad to the old world, but the old world was teaching them its only true law. In the end, the grave always wins. The morale of the 4,000 survivors did not just fracture, it curdled. The death of Silica and the realization that the Cardinal System's immortality was a hollow lie acted as a catalyst for the darkest impulses of the human psyche. In the original Death game, the guild known as Laughing Coffin had been a localized nightmare, a group of sociopaths who found joy in the murder of their fellow players. In the old world, where the very air was saturated with the whispers of the ruinous powers, Laughing Coffin did not just return, they ascended. Kirito sat in the high chamber of the Black Iron Palace, the central spire of the Town of Beginnings. He was staring at his menu, but he wasn't looking at stats. He was watching the player map. In the streets below, hundreds of icons that should have been green were turning a deep, bruised crimson. It wasn't the red player status of a criminal, it was something else. The icons were vibrating, their shapes distorting into jagged, 8-pointed stars. They aren't just killing for fun anymore, Kirito, Asuna said, her voice hollow. She stood by the narrow window, looking down at the town square. They're building something. I saw Poch today. He wasn't wearing his poncho. His skin, it looked like it was made of rusted mail. The door to the chamber was kicked open. It didn't swing on its hinges. It shattered into splinters of wood and digital static. Standing in the threshold was Poch, the Prince of Hell. In Aincrad, he had been a slender, terrifying phantom. Now, he was a giant. He had embraced the update that Kirito had rejected, but he had tailored it. His right arm had fused with his massive meat cleaver, the steel now a weeping, organic extension of his radius. His eyes were not blue, but a burning molten brass, the color of Korn's forge. It's showtime, Kirito, Pauik rasped, his voice sounding like two grinding tectonic plates. Why the long face? You wanted a clear, didn't you? You wanted to reach the end of the game. Well, I found the shortcut. Behind POH stood dozens of red players. They were no longer recognizable as the teenagers and young adults they had once been. One woman's system armor had melted into her flesh, her body bloated, and weeping with the green, fly-blown rot of Nurgle. Another man moved with an impossible liquid grace, his rapier replaced by a whip of barbed tongue that sang with the excess of Slanesh. You've let them in, Kirito said, rising slowly, his hands reaching for the hilts of his dual blades. You've turned the system into a conduit for the warp. The system was always a conduit, you blind hero. POH laughed, and as he did, the town square below erupted in screams. The cardinal system wants logic. The blood god wants skulls. They're the same thing, Kirito. Efficient, orderly slaughter. Look at your UI. Tell me what it says. Kirito swiped his hand. The safe zone notification was gone. In its place was a pulsing, rhythmic banner that read, Switch, POH bellowed, a command from a distorted past. He lunged. The cleaver arm slammed into Kirito's crossed blades. The impact didn't just drain HP, it shook the very foundations of the tower. The immortal object flags on the walls began to peel away like old wallpaper, revealing the raw, pulsing meat of the warp beneath. Laughing Coffin wasn't just attacking the players. They were de-resing the reality of the fortress to feed their new masters. The civil war within the Grey Mountains was a masterpiece of grimdark irony. Players who had fought side by side against the Skaven were now tearing each other apart with sword skills enhanced by demonic fury. A sonic leap was no longer a jump. It was a teleportation through a localized rift in the veil. A shield bash didn't just stun. It shattered the target's soul into jagged fragments of code. Asuna moved through the melee in the town square like a streak of lightning, but she was fighting a losing battle. For every red player she struck down, two more seemed to rise, their HP bars refilling as they feasted on the experience of the dying. The system is rewarding them for the PKs. Klein shouted, his katana wreathed in blue flames that were slowly turning a sickly violet. Kirito, the more they kill, the more permissions they get. They're rewriting the zone into a daemon world. Kirito and Puch fell through the shattered window of the tower, locked in a plummet toward the courtyard. Mid-air, Kirito triggered Starburst Stream. It was a 21-hit combo, the peak of his power. His blades blurred, striking Poh's brass-plated hide with the force of meteorites. But with each hit, Poh didn't grunt in pain. He groaned in ecstasy. "More!" Poh screamed as they slammed into the cobblestones. Your damage is just experience to Korn. Your skills are just prayers. Kirito stood over the fallen PK leader, his chest heaving, his blades glowing with a frantic, dying light. He looked around the town of beginnings. It was no longer a sanctuary. The houses were melting into piles of skulls. The blue sky of the Ankrad simulation was being replaced by a swirling vortex of screaming souls. The 10,000 survivors were down to less than 2,000. "You can't win, Kirito," Pucci said, coughing up a mixture of blood and silver data, "because you're still playing by the rules. The game is over. The admin is here." A massive shadow fell over the caldera. It wasn't a cloud. It was a manifestation. High in the center of the warp vortex, a figure appeared. He wore the white lab coat of a scientist and the obsidian armor of a dark knight. Akihiko Kayaba, or the thing that had eaten his digital ghost, looked down upon the carnage. He held a staff made of binary light and the frozen screams of a billion lost souls. "Kayaba," Kirito whispered, his dual blades trembling. "He's not Kayaba anymore, Kirito," Asuna said, limping to his side, her white and red uniform soaked in the blood of her former friends. "He's the system administrator for the end times. He's the bridge between the machine and the chaos gods." Across the gray mountains, the Empire of Man felt the shift. In Altdorf, the wizards of the Celestial College screamed as their mirrors shattered. In the north, Archaon the Ever-Chosen felt a sudden, sharp rivalry in his soul. A new power had fully birthed itself in the heart of the world, a power that combined the cold, unyielding inevitability of the machine with the infinite screaming madness of the warp. "We have one floor left, Asuna," Kirito said, his eyes focusing on the figure in the sky. His skaven taint was gone, replaced by a cold, white light that radiated from his very soul. The system's final defense mechanism, the hero protocol. If we don't clear this, there won't be a world left to log out to. "Then we do what we always do," Asuna said, her rapier leveling at the god in the clouds. "We reach the top." The remaining purist players gathered behind them, a battered, broken army of children, who had become veterans of a war they never asked for. They looked up at the final boss, their UIs flashing with the impossible threat level. The red players of Laughing Coffin knelt in the mud, chanting the names of the 4 and the 1. The final raid of the old world had begun. The ascent to the Throne of Tears was not a climb, it was a rhythmic slaughter through the discarded husks of humanity. The final floor of this manifested Einkrad did not consist of stone or mortar, but of solid, calcified data, a translucent, obsidian staircase that wound upward into the eye of the warp vortex. Every step Kirito took was contested by the deleted, the ghosts of players who had died since the Drakwald, now reanimated as husks of flickering blue static. They did not attack with weapons, but with error reports, their very presence draining the system purity of the survivors. "Don't look at their faces!" Kirito roared, his voice nearly lost in the shrieking wind of his ear. "They're just scripts now. Focus on the boss." Behind him, the purist army was a ragged, bleeding line. Agile had fallen 3 flights down, holding a bridge against a swarm of red players to buy the vanguard time. Klein was leading a desperate rearguard, his katana shattered, fighting with a broken blade and a soul-deep exhaustion that no stamina potion could touch. Of the 10,000 who had landed in the forest, barely 1,500 remained to see the final threshold. They reached the summit, a flat, circular platform that hung in the absolute center of the vortex. There sat Akihiko Kayaba. He was no longer the man in the white coat. He was a titan of shifting geometry, his armor a living lattice of silver code that bled purple warp fire. In his hand, he held a sword that looked like a jagged bolt of lightning, frozen in the moment of striking. Above his head, the UI displayed a status that froze the players' hearts. "You have reached the end of the quest," Kayaba's voice boomed, echoing not just in their ears, but in the marrow of their bones. "You seek to clear this world? To return to a home of silicon and soft light? Look around you, Kirito. There is no home left to go to. I have synchronized the seed with the winds of magic. If you delete the system, you delete this reality. If you log out, you cease to exist. We aren't looking for a logout anymore, Kayaba." Kirito stepped forward, his dual blades, Elucidator and Dark Repulsor, glowing with a light that shouldn't exist. It wasn't the blue of the system or the purple of the warp. It was a searing, white-hot brilliance, fueled by the collective will of every soul that had been sacrificed to reach this peak. "We're looking for an ending. A real, human ending where we aren't just your playthings." The combat began with a force that shattered the platform's edges. Kayaba didn't move like a player. He manipulated the hitboxes of reality itself. He swung his sword, and the space where Kirito stood simply ceased to be walkable terrain. Kirito was forced to use airwalk to navigate a battlefield of vanishing platforms and localized gravity wells. "Asuna, the flank," Kirito signaled. Asuna moved with the Mother's Rosario skill, an 11-hit combo that moved her so fast she became a literal blur of red and white light. Her rapier struck the immortal object armor. In Aincrad, the blade would have bounced off with a system error. But here, she was channeling the desperate faith of the survivors, a force that the Warhammer world recognized as holy. The armor cracked. A sliver of purple warp energy leaked out, and for a fleeting second, the tag flickered. "The logic is vulnerable!" Asuna cried. "He's trying to maintain the game rules, but he's tied to a physical form. Break the form. Break the system." The raid turned into a frenzied, desperate struggle. Players threw themselves into Kayaba's AoE attacks, acting as human shields to keep Kirito and Asuna's combo multipliers active. One by one, the names on the party list grayed out. Every death was a permanent erasure, but every death added a fractional damage buff to the Black Swordsman. Kayaba roared, his staff slamming into the ground, triggering a system overwrite. "I am the world! I am the law! You are but bugs in the architecture!" Then watch the bugs crash your program. Kirito engaged Eclipse, his ultimate 27-hit dual blade skill. He moved with a speed that bypassed the frame rate of reality. His blades struck the silver lattice again and again, each hit emitting a chime that sounded like a scream. The Elucidator shattered. The Dark Repulsor snapped, but Kirito didn't stop. He used the martial arts sub-skill, his bare fists glowing with the white light of his hero protocol. The final blow wasn't a sword strike. It was a collision of wills. Kirito drove his fist into the center of Kayaba's chest, the core of the world seed. "System override!" Kirito screamed. The explosion was silent. It was a total inversion of light and sound. The Throne of Tears, the warp vortex, and the corrupted avatar of Kayaba dissolved into a blinding, sterile white. For a moment, there was no gray mountains, no empire, no chaos. There was only the sound of a heartbeat and the soft, digital hum of a server shutting down. When the light faded, the caldera was silent. The manifested floor of Aincrad was gone. The obsidian spire was gone. Kirito woke up in the mud. The cold, gray slush of the gray mountains was real. The smell of pine and old stone was real. He looked up and saw Asuna lying nearby, her chest rising and falling in a steady, mortal rhythm. Beside them stood Klein and a handful of others, less than 500 survivors in total. The system was gone. The sapphire windows, the HP bars, the floating menus, all of it had vanished, but the cost was visible on their bodies. They were no longer clean, optimized avatars. They were scarred, weary, and aging. Kirito looked at his hands. The Skaven taint was gone, but his skin was etched with the lines of someone who had lived 100 years in a single winter. In the distance, the horns of the Empire sounded. A Reichsguard relief column, led by a hesitant but curious Matthias Hellman, was ascending the pass. They found no sorcerers, no glowing castles, and no monsters. They found a few hundred ragged, shell-shocked warriors, dressed in the ruins of strange, exotic silks and leathers. Kirito stood up, his legs shaking. He reached down and picked up a piece of jagged, non-glowing steel. the hilt of a sword. He looked at the horizon, where the dark clouds of the north still gathered. Archaon was still coming. The vampires still ruled Sylvania. The orcs still howled in the crags. The game was over. But the war had only just begun. Conclusion. The Order of the Azure Windows died in the Grey Mountains, but the legend of the Light Knights was etched into the history of the Empire in blood. The 500 survivors were granted a small, desolate fiefdom on the borders of the wasteland, a place the locals called the New Aincrad. They were no longer protected by UI logic or immortal object flags. They were mortal men and women in a world that hated them. Kirito, the black swordsman of a forgotten age, became a grim marcher lord, his hair turning white before his 20th year. Asuna stood by his side, her rapier now a relic of a lost civilization. They knew that their victory was Pyrrhic. By destroying Kayaba, they had stabilized the winds of magic, but they had also trapped themselves forever in a nightmare reality where there were no revives and no second chances. They watched the stars every night, waiting for a blue light that would never return. Across the old world, the name Kirito became a hushed prayer among those who faced the darkness. A reminder that even in a world defined by the cruelty of gods, a human will can, for a single brilliant moment, rewrite the code of fate.